So today on Grail Country, I'm honored to have theologian, author, philosopher, and pastor J.D. Lyonhart on the program. And we're going to talk about his book, Monothreeism, which has the wonderful subtitle of An Absurdly Arrogant Attempt to Answer Every Question of the Last 2,000 Years, One Night in a Pub. So intriguing subtitle there. How'd you come up with that?
I felt like it kind of captured the tone of the book, because it is a kind of, sorry, my phone's going off.
No problem.
I felt like it captured the kind of tone of the book, because I'm trying to do something that's very broad, and theologians aren't supposed to do that. We're supposed to kind of specialize in specific areas,
Right,
and become an expert on it and never say anything that isn't perfectly aware of the thousands of other things that people said about it. And I felt like what I was trying to do was absurdly arrogant. So I thought I will put that in the title, because I'm trying to cover.
Well, because tackling the Trinity alone was audacious enough.
Yeah.
And then it's like, it's the Trinity and stuff.
Yeah, and free will, the Trinity and free will, and the origins of the universe. And I didn't know how else to do it than in an almost satirical way.
Right. Yeah.
Because if I tried to write this as a very academic book with a very professional subtitle, I would have had to have cited everyone ever.
Right. So. Let's talk a little about the choice of the style you chose to. So you wrote this in the form of a dramatic dialogue.
Yeah.
With three characters.
Well,
and
here's the book if
there's
people are wondering.
Yep. There we go. And there'll be
have to do that.
Absolutely. And there'll be a link in the description along with a link to JD's website, so you can see his other books as well. So you chose to write it in the form of a dramatic dialogue. It's obviously a book that is intended for general audiences. All of the academic stuff is in the footnotes. You can read the dialogue without ever looking at the footnotes or being intimidated by any of the technical details. And there's a lot of humor and a lot of pop culture references. Why did you decide to go that route with the book?
A couple of things. I think first of all, because that's what I felt excited about doing. I find it very hard to get terribly excited about writing an academic treatise. I always want it to be sort of deep ideas and sort of a narrative creative structure. I think I have pretty severe ADHD, and I don't mean that in the way that people self-diagnose it casually by doing an online quiz, but actual like medically diagnosed ADHD, took Ritalin kind of thing. And so I need something exciting in order to do anything. And I needed this creative side of things to make the project something I was excited about. So I don't know if that's a great answer, but in order to put the effort in to complete a book, I need that creative burst to get me to wake up in the morning and actually work on it. So I think that was a huge part of it. The other side is it's a really complex idea, and I've tried to write it before as an academic type treatise, and it was just so difficult to do. I felt the dialectical conversational style of things allowed me to really draw out the ideas and then to pause and have a character go, wait, what do you mean by that? Let's talk more about that.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean this, and I know I'm saying that this is not academic, it's popular level, but in a sense, it's actually the most ancient form of academic discourse. It's the Socratic dialogue. So.
But you actually took, like, there's actually like some features of modern playwriting that you took into consideration here, because the text isn't really, it's not just three talking heads. There's actually things that are happening. You've kind of like written in things that would amount to like stage direction, so that there's actually like, there's a visual component, there are things happening. It's not just three people talking. So you have some of like the expected activity of a pub, which is where you've said it, actually going on in the dialogue. So it very much like actually kind of reads like a play.
Yeah, I suppose I wanted to be a playwright but wasn't good enough. And I wanted to be a theologian, but I wasn't good enough. So I just said, well, let's split the difference and try to do both at once and hope no one notices. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it made it for something that was pretty unique and very readable, and I'm definitely going to recommend it to pretty much all of my audience. I think anyone really can get something out of this. So let's talk about the very unusual approach you've taken to like the core issue that you kind of the Trinity is kind of that's why it's called Monothreeism is the main title. The Trinity is kind of the main thing that you're jumping off point for all the rest of the stuff that you discuss. And you take a very unorthodox approach and just basically saying up front, you base the idea that it's an apparent contradiction or a paradox. And you actually use the word contradiction a lot in the text.
Yeah.
Like, why did you decide to just lean right into that?
Yeah. So, yeah, should I maybe give a basic overview of the idea?
Absolutely.
For the audience, and then I can play with that from the.
Go for it.
So the basic idea of the book is that when you look at the Trinity, how can God be 3 and 1? 1 plus 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 1, it equals 3. There's this sort of central tension there that is very hard to resolve. It seems a bit absurd. And so a lot of people have decided not to believe in the Trinitarian God because, well, it doesn't make sense. And I think I would have been in that camp. But then I started to study the origins of the universe when I got into philosophy and somewhat into the philosophy of science. And I realized that the origins of the universe also don't make sense. And the more and more I looked at it, the more that I realized that the same way in which it didn't make sense was actually the same way that the Trinity doesn't make sense. That the problem that we encounter when trying to make sense of how we came to exist at all actually conceptually looks almost identical to the same philosophical problems that we have when we talk about the Trinity. And I can get into more depth further on about what that problem is and how those are parallels. But if it is a parallel and the problem of the Trinity is the same one that is at the heart of how we came to exist at all, then perhaps it becomes as rational to believe in the Trinity as it is to believe in our own existence. And the reason I kind of give you that background is in response to your contradiction stuff, I am basically just accepting that the Trinity seems like a contradiction, but yet it's still rational to believe in because actually the origins of the universe seem like a contradiction as well in the same way. And so the Trinity is as rational to believe in as our own existence. All that to say, and to answer your actual question, I don't know if the Trinity is a contradiction.
Right.
My argument isn't that it is irrational or not. It's rather that we can't dismiss belief in it, even though it appears to be a contradiction. So perhaps when we die, we'll get to heaven and God will say, well, you missed this, this, and this. That's how all this makes sense. I'm totally open to that option. I'm totally open to the Trinity not being a contradiction, to there being some rational explanation. I'm merely saying that it's okay to believe in it now, even if it does appear like a contradiction, because, well, we actually believe the exact same thing when we're talking about the universe itself.
Right. Well, and the contradiction is specifically only applies if you're thinking in terms of quantity. But the infinite is precisely not a quantity.
Yeah, if you just sort of embrace that the infinite is beyond finite addition or sense, then yeah.
It's right, exactly. So you can see, but it's still a paradox, even if it's not a contradiction. I mean, like, so I can, like, there's still value in what you're doing here. It's particularly for particular minds that are fixated on, and as a lot of people are in the modern world, like fixated on the realm of quantity and the measurable.
Yeah, and that's really all I'm saying, is that there's, no matter what worldview you take, as long as you believe the universe exists, there is something that is beyond the finite mind's ability to grasp.
Right.
And so, yeah.
So you're just kind of like rather than try to resist that, sort of maybe overly quantitative analysis that like takes quality out of the universe, what you're doing is you're just saying, okay, if that's so, this is what it still looks like. And there's still room for something like the Trinity, because as you point out, the type of paradox or apparent contradiction you run into is exactly the same as trying to explain the universe at all.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. So it's a very interesting approach. Do you want to say anything more about do you want to get into like your actual argument there about how those apparent contradictions are parallel?
I'm happy to do so if you think that would be helpful. Once we do that, it's going to get very complicated very quick. So I'm open to whatever you want to do.
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
I have a smart audience. I trust them.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Yeah. So the problem with the Trinity, when you kind of look at it, is there's this father figure, this eternal, absolute, and in classical theism, this immutable type of figure. And in the Old Testament, he you can't even see his face without dying, right? There's a deeply transcendent aspect to him. And then somehow the scandal of the incarnation is that God comes down as a fellow human being who we can touch, hug, crucify. And somehow this Jesus fellow is one with this eternal father figure. And it's very difficult to make sense of how that connection works. And then you throw in the spirit and it just gets even more complex. And some people would say that it's outright irrational. Though I don't know if you have to say that or not, but I can understand anyone taking that side if they wanted to. I get why they would think it's irrational. And if that's the case, then you might say, well, I'm not going to believe in it. I'm not going to believe in the Trinity. This doesn't make sense. How can God be up there and down here, eternal and temporal at the same time, Father and Son and Spirit? But then when you look at the origins of the universe, a very similar thing arises. And I kind of split answers into the origins of the universe into three options: being, becoming, or both. And I'll get into those now.
Go for it. Yeah.
So when we're trying to explain the universe existing, what we're trying to explain is the existence of becoming, of a universe that is in time and space and is becoming other things, that's changing, that's growing, that's evolving, that is in time and space. Cities rise and fall. We are born and mature and die. The seasons come and go. This is the realm of becoming, where things are changing, growing. It's the realm of time. And so we're trying to explain how this universe of time and becoming began to exist. And kind of a first option to try to explain that is to appeal to more becoming. Well, what caused our planet? Well, elements from the stars and all of those types of things. Well, what caused the stars? And then you go back and then you get to the Big Bang. And then the question is, well, what caused the Big Bang? And you could take that a bit further. Well, maybe there was a universe there before the Big Bang. And maybe before that universe, there was another universe, and it's bangs all the way down. And so you end up with this infinite regression of becoming, where becoming explains itself, becoming, explaining, becoming, explaining, becoming, explaining, becoming ad infinitum. And the point I make there is that might be the case, but I don't know if our finite minds can ever make sense of that. I think infinity is beyond our ability to understand it. And
right, because in the realm of logic, like Aquinas's arguments, like against that possibility, definitely hold for our brains.
Yes, totally. And mathematicians talk about Cantor's infinites and those types of things. And I don't want to claim to be a mathematician. I'm not. But my sense is that those systems only work once you accept certain assumptions that themselves don't make sense to us. So at the end of the day, I think there's a logical leap that's required to talk about infinity. There's a certain point at which you're saying something exists here that is beyond my grasp. And not just my grasp, but the grasp of the human race, the human mind. So I would say that because
of the nature of the way we perceive the world, like you're talking about things that we don't have any choice or option in.
For sure, exactly.
Yeah.
So I would say, if you're trying to explain the universe, explaining becoming doesn't work. You end up with an infinite regression. And the sort of problems there, I mean, we're getting into it a little bit, but say I was to offer you a cheeseburger after an infinite period of time had elapsed. Would you ever get the cheeseburger? Well, a lot of people would say, no, I wouldn't get it, because infinity would have to occur first, and you can never reach infinity through finite time. And so if an infinite period of time had to have occurred before this moment in time, an infinite regression of becoming, we never would have actually reached this moment in time.
Right.
That's one example. Or like Hilbert's hotel. Say you have an infinite number of hotels, and half the people you have an infinite number of hotel rooms, and half the people in the hotel check out. So you have people in room 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Half the people in the infinite hotel have checked out. How many hotel rooms are still there? Filled. Well, you'd still have to say it's infinite, because half of infinity can't be some finite number like 10 billion, or else infinity is 10 billion times 2. So half of infinity has to still be infinity. And so you get these kinds of paradoxes where reason kind of breaks down. And mathematicians have some clever responses to that. I don't want to get into too much of that stuff, because that's where we're going to get overly nuanced to death. But I think infinity requires a sort of logical leap. So I would say becoming, explaining, becoming doesn't work, which is why theologians and philosophers have often appealed to something that is outside of becoming in order to explain the universe of becoming. So you keep going back. What caused the planet? What caused the universe? What caused the Big Bang? What caused the thing that caused the Big Bang? What caused the thing that caused the thing that caused the Big Bang? You keep going back. And eventually, if an infinite regression isn't a possibility, there has to be something that isn't in this infinite temporal regress of becoming. And that has often been referred to as being. Something that is eternal and outside of time. It doesn't need a cause of its existence because it never began to exist. It exists outside of time. And so words like beginning or ending or cause, those don't apply to it. So within the realm of becoming, temporal words like cause and effect, beginning and end, those apply. And so for everything in becoming, you need an explanation of what caused it, and then you need an explanation for that. But if we're talking about something that's outside of time, something that isn't becoming, but is being itself, then we don't need an infinite regress. It doesn't need something to explain it. It just is eternally, timelessly outside of time. It doesn't need a cause because it never began to exist. It's timeless. And this, of course, we're seeing the cosmological argument in the background here. People critique infinity, and so there must be a first cause, and that must be a timeless being. And then they want to say, well, that's God. And we've heard that many times before. That's a classic argument.
This everyone calls God is what Aquinas.
Yeah, what everyone calls God. And so often people will say, well, what explains the universe of becoming? Being. And they act like they've solved it. But my problem is, how can something that is timeless begin to create in time?
Right. That I want to just talk about that for just interrupt for just a moment, because I want to talk about that, because that actually really resonated with me, because not too long ago on my channel we did a series on M.L. Bach's The Apocalypse of John. So it was his symbolic interpretation of the Apocalypse of John. And what the way Bach interprets Revelations chapter 4 and 5 with the transformation of the lion into the lamb is he sees that as actually like a heavenly version of what's going on in the Genesis story. So like the book of the 7 seals that is to be opened is the becoming, right? That you're talking about. And so but the transformation of the lion into the lamb shows a potential of becoming within being. That's symbolically.
That's a really interesting interpretation.
Yeah, it's a very interesting interpretation, and I couldn't help but think of it when I was reading that portion of your book. But anyway, now that I've said that, you can continue.
No, it's fine. We need to pause occasionally to talk about other things, because it's hard to give this whole framework of my idea at once. So it's good. So yeah, becoming can't explain itself. Becoming can't explain becoming. But then some people think being can explain becoming. But my issue with that is, how can something that is outside of time, that is timeless being, begin to create a universe of becoming? if the cause is timeless and eternal, the effect must be timeless and eternal. If God is eternally, timelessly creating the universe, then the universe is eternally and timelessly created and being created. And so the universe becomes timeless as well. And so in that, you have negated the existence of actual temporal becoming, because this would all have to be eternal.
Let me just interject really quick. What about, I don't know if you consider this possibility, but a friend of mine who has a channel called The Meaning Code, she had a physicist that she talked there that she interviewed a while back. And he was suggesting the notion that essentially that the universe is recreated moment to moment.
So if it's recreated in a temporal sense, that would almost be in the infinite regression of becoming category.
Mm-hmm.
What timeless creation would be is not that it's happening over and over again in a cyclical temporal process, but that it's just one eternal thing where all of it is timelessly occurring. Not over and over again, but once and for all.
Yeah, as a Christian, the interesting part of that to me, though, is that it kind of points toward this notion that Christians have always held, that God doesn't just create the universe, but that He sustains it. So a physicist being able to see that creation, like kind of like being knitted together moment to moment, kind of points toward that God sustaining things in creation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I wouldn't necessarily say that that's not a way that we could go. If you want to avoid saying that becoming exists at all and just say it's all eternal, timeless being, including the created universe, you can go that direction.
Right.
But that is in some sense to negate that the universe of time and space exists in the sense that we do, which why
a lot of physicists kind of do.
Yeah. Which is a move you can make. And I accept that that's a possible move, but I emphasize that once again, you're requiring a leap of the mind's categories, because I think that time is about as fundamental to our perception of the universe as logic itself. And I get into a lot of that discussion in the book. But so once again, if you want to deny the temporal becoming of the universe and make the universe itself something that's bound up in the eternal, you can. But just like with infinity, there's going to be a leap of our mind's ability to grasp what's going on here, because I exist within time. To imagine something outside of time is to go beyond my ability to grasp what we're talking about.
Right. Because you have no frame of reference.
Yeah, everything
whatsoever
for me occurs within time. I mean, I agree with Kant on that point. Like, I don't know how to perceive something non-temporally. So, yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So, did I cut you off there? Did you have
no, not at all. Not
Yeah.
at all. If anything, I interrupted you.
It's fine. I mean, it's your show, man. You can. So yeah, my basic argument is becoming can't explain a becoming, or else that leads to a breakdown in reason when we talk about infinity. Being can't explain becoming, because how could something that's timeless begin to create in time? To begin to do something would mean that it's no longer timeless. So in order to get out of the infinite regression, we had to make being timeless. But in doing that, we negate its ability to create anything at all, except in the sense that it might eternally be creating timelessly. But then whatever it created would be itself timeless. And so you wouldn't really have the temporal creation of becoming that we phenomenologically think we have. Becoming leads to a breakdown.
Can I just, one thing, yeah. I just had a thought occur to me. Let's see where we go with this. We've been doing a series on Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot on this channel as well. And it's, if you think about some of the things that Tomberg says about evolution, where he actually links like he links evolution to the fall, and in a kind of interesting way. But I just wonder about the possibility, because of this of linking time to, if you link time to the fall, and if you have like a view like Maximus, where like essentially the interval between like the creation of Adam and the fall is basically there is no real meaningful like primordial time before the fall, that it essentially happens at the moment of the creation. You could still have both the fallen temporal order and the eternal created order at the same time. And I said that very, very badly, but I hope you follow me.
No, I guess if we're willing to say that that occurs in some way that's beyond our understanding, then fine. I'm on board with that. Because I mean, that's ultimately what I'm saying,
Right.
is that whatever we put in this place is going to break down reason. But I guess for me, the idea that the fall is the beginning of time and would require that the fall in itself would have to somehow be eternal. Because where does the eternal meet time? And wherever it does meet, you're going to have a forward facing aspect to that, but also the backward facing. The part that's eternal and the part that's temporal will somehow have to be both of those things. If there is this timeless thing that is leading to the fall itself would have to be timeless. Would kind of be my thing.
No, I was saying that the fall is actually linked to the temporal. But I understand what you're saying, because you're actually talking about like the possibility of the origin at all.
Yeah, the possibility of falling in that case.
Right. Okay, so continue. I
No,
really didn't mean to derail you there.
You're fine. But the idea that time and the fall are linked is a really interesting one. That would have a much broader discussion to go along with it. Yeah, I'm just focusing on whether the fall itself could happen without time already existing in order for one to do the falling.
Right.
But yeah, so I mean, I'm still kind of building the argument here, so I'll try to finish it off. Explaining becoming requires a leap in logic. Being explaining the universe of becoming requires some kind of leap of logic. Because how can a timeless thing begin to create something in time? And so being and becoming can't quite explain our universe in a rational way. But what about if we combine them? And I call this the both option. There's being, there's becoming, and then there's both. What if there was a timeless entity that was also able to begin to create in time? An entity that was both being and becoming in itself at the same time and in the same way. It would be timeless, so it wouldn't need an infinite regression of causes. It has always existed, but it would also be temporal and able to begin to create in time. It would be being and becoming together as one. And so
and now all the classical theists' heads just exploded.
Yeah. The both option is being and becoming together as one. The problem, at least philosophically, and you could have a theological problem with that as well, but the problem philosophically is, well, isn't that a contradiction? Something that is timeless and temporal in the same way. It's not like it's part timeless and part temporal, because then you just regurgitate the previous question, which is how does the temporal part relate to the timeless part? And that was the original problem. No, it can't be part temporal and part timeless. It has to be an actual contradiction, where it's 100% timeless and 100% temporal, 100% atemporal and 100% temporal. And so that would be a contradiction. So once again, it would require a leap in logic. And so I argue that this actually means that when you're talking about the origins of the universe, we can't make sense of it, because this actually exhausts the options, in my opinion. To explain our existence, you can either appeal to something that is atemporal, something that is temporal, or something that is both. Either A, non-A, or both. Like it's kind of an exhaustive type of exercise. And I argue that most of the origins of the universe explanations we see, whether it's in religion or philosophy or even in the sciences, will fall into one of these three categories. And I think all three of them ultimately require that leap in logic. They ultimately are unable to explain how eternal being can unite with temporal becoming in order to explain our universe. And so the essential problem there is, how does the transcendent, timeless, eternal merge with the temporal, finite?
Which is the same question at the heart of Christology too.
how does the eternal timeless Father, this Jesus dude who's incarnate in flesh on earth? And so my argument is that the problem of the Trinity is actually the same problem of being and becoming. And so you can no more dismiss the Trinity than you can dismiss your own existence. That doesn't prove the Trinity is real, but it does show that you can't dismiss it for having this internal irrationality, because it's the same internal rationality when you're talking about existence itself.
Mhm.
And the fact that our irrationality seems to parallel the universe's irrationality is almost a source of pride. We're talking about the same problems that reality is talking about. And if you aren't talking about those problems, if your religion avoids those problems, well, congratulations, you've become so rational that you've out-reasoned reality, and you're no longer talking about the actual world. You're just talking about some rationally consistent thing in your own head that doesn't deal with the irrationality and paradox of actual existence. So yeah, that's kind of the argument. And I get much more in depth with all of that in the book, of course, but
Which actually kind of like what you just said there, that kind of like resonates with your stylistic choice of how you wrote this book, right? Because you didn't try to write, you didn't write it in the style of a book of academic philosophy or academic theology. You said it as a dramatic dialogue in a pub. So you kind of are reflecting this idea of you're wanting to come to something that reflects the messiness of existence in this kind of like more embodied kind of fashion that you presented your argument.
An incarnational discussion.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of people have looked at it and thought, oh, this is a popular level book, not an academic one. But I really am trying to do, as you said, an incarnationally embodied academic discussion. And I actually wonder if more theology should be done that way, not merely to appease the churchgoer, but because perhaps that's actually what theology should be more so in an incarnational sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you ever see yourself actually ever trying to produce this as a theatrical production, since you've written it, so that it wouldn't take much? I mean, you'd have to shorten it a little bit, because it's about a little bit less than a 2-hour read, I think. So that means probably as a performance piece, it would be a little bit longer than that. So that might be a bit long. So you might have to do some editing here or there, but it seems like it would be a viable project. You ever given any thought to that?
Yeah, I think my sense is it might just be too philosophical for it to really work. I mean, there's some narrative arc there, but I don't know how well it would work as an actual play. It might be something that, like, you know, I don't know.
What drove you to write your little, like, kind of like M. Night Shyamalan inspired ending then, where you have your little twist at the end? That seems like, I mean, at least somewhere in the back of your head, you're operating with very, very much a dramatist sensibilities and doing. I used to write plays too, by the way, so that's why.
Okay.
So, and also like you, I wasn't very good. My ex-wife was very good. She won a Kennedy Center Award when we were in college, but I wasn't as good. And I wrote plays that were very philosophical like this. So,
yeah. Well, I wonder if maybe a toned down version. Yeah, it couldn't.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, maybe perhaps. I do think it could make a very good audiobook.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm talking to the publisher about that right now.
Nice. Yeah, that would makes total sense. It seems like that would almost have to happen, since it says a dialogue anyway.
Yeah,
it's perfectly fit for an audiobook. So yeah. So do you want let's not spoiler your ending. We'll just like leave that, but it does have there's a little bit of a twist at the end.
Yeah.
So do you want to touch on any of the, like, so this is kind of like your starting point in the book, but like as your subtitle indicates, you're kind of jumping off from that point to showing how the same sort of path of thought like leads you to think differently about some other issues. You want to touch on any of those?
Yeah, I mean, there's 12, 13 other issues that I connect to it, so I can't go too in depth.
No, you don't have to don't go into depth on all. Just pick the ones that you think that are most salient.
Yeah, the basic structure of the argument that I just made, where I parallel the origins of the universe to the Trinity, and say it makes as much sense as our own existence, I then do that same thing with a lot of other things as well. So like free will, I parallel the origins of the universe to free will and argue that free will doesn't make that much sense, but actually it doesn't make sense in precisely the way that our existence doesn't make sense. So perhaps it makes as much sense as our own existence to believe in free will. And that parallel should have been obvious from the beginning, because Christians have always believed that the creation of the universe was a free act,
Right.
of God. So and that parallel can get a lot more
But it's
complex.
also one of those things we don't really have an opt out of from our perception, right? So even if you can engage in the intellectual exercise of denying that we have free will, but you can only engage in it as an intellectual exercise. Your actual experience as an embodied being in the world is definitely one of having free will.
Yeah, phenomenologically, it's I don't know if it's quite as fundamental as the embodied experience of time, but it's
No.
close. Like
It's not quite. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
It's and the fact that you have that experience might be more powerful than the arguments against free will, because there's powerful arguments against free will.
Very powerful.
I've never heard anyone explain free will in a way that made sense to me, but sometimes it feels to me that epistemically I have a stronger experience of free will than I have of the persuasiveness of those arguments against it. And I think that's a valid place to go to, is to say, my phenomenological experiences of the world are all I really have to draw on. And your arguments are ultimately going to reduce to those type of experiences as well. So why not trust my experience of free will? I mean, that's not the argument I make in the book, but it could go nicely with it.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So
you want to touch on any of the other ones?
Gosh,
That's a pretty big one though. Free will
been a
is
couple of years since I actually wrote it. I'm like, what are the other ones?
It's okay.
Gosh. Yeah, well, another one is sorry, I'm looking at the book. Here, I'll use this as a time to pitch the cover again.
Yes.
Promotional. Well, we could maybe go in depth.
It's a very entertaining and readable book, and you should all buy it.
Thank you. Maybe we could go in depth on the free will one, because I think that's my favorite parallel.
Let's do it.
So when we're talking about the origins of the universe, we're talking about how can the timeless nature of an entity act outside of its nature to begin to create in time. That's essentially the problem of the origins of the universe. And again, it's the same problem with the Trinity. When we're talking about free will, I think it's a very similar problem, because the question is, how can we make a choice that comes from us, that's my choice, that derives from my nature, but that isn't deterministically forced by my nature? So the problem of determinism is, if every effect has a cause, then all that I am, all the combination of nurture and nature, every experience I've ever had, all of that causes my choices, and it causes me to be who I am. So where is the free will in that? Because all of those causes stretch back billions of years to before I even existed, right? So I'm just utterly a product, and perhaps
this is why atheists are always determinists.
Yeah, there we go. And so I might feel like a choice is coming from me. I want that ice cream, or I want to go to that school, and it might be coming from me. No one forced me to make that choice. It's from my own desires, but my desires themselves aren't something I chose. Those are things that are the product of billions, millions of years of cause and effect leading to who I am today. So how I was brought up, my biology, all of those things. And so my nature causing something doesn't really mean I've achieved free will, because my nature isn't free. It's a product. So the problem of determinism is that we're limited and restricted to our natures. Now, in order to avoid that problem, some people have come up with what they called indeterminism, that not every effect has a cause, that things can sort of randomly pop out of nowhere. And that way we're not stuck in this deterministic system. And quantum physics has given a renewed vigor to that option. During the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, the deterministic argument seemed pretty strong. If you take a Newtonian view of the universe, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So where's the free will in that machine of cause and effect? But once that kind of Newtonian view began to have some holes, people thought, great, quantum mechanics, we can say that perhaps not every effect has a cause. And so maybe that's where free will is an indeterministic system. The problem with that, though, is that if my choices are uncaused, then they can't be caused by me as the chooser. If they come uncaused out of nothing, then how can they even be called my choices? Aren't they more analogous to the random jerkings of an arm than to something that I've actually chosen to do? And so that's the issue. If you go with determinism, then we are limited to our natures. And so our choices are limited to our nature. But if you go with the other option, indeterminism, then you can no longer say that your choices are caused by your nature because they're uncaused. They came out of nowhere. And so free will would almost seem to need both to be true in a way. It would need this contradiction of something that's caused by me, but isn't deterministically forced by me. Something that's both deterministic and indeterministic at the same time. Both something that a choice that derives from my nature, but isn't limited by my nature. You kind of need both to be true. And when you actually look at the origins of the universe, it's a very similar thing. How does the nature of a timeless being act outside of itself to begin to create in time? And if you go with the both contradiction option, which I argue parallels the Trinity, then you actually kind of have to say both are true. A timeless being created the universe by acting outside of its nature to begin to create in time, and yet it also was the one who created it, because it's both being and becoming. It's the contradiction. So I argue that the contradiction of free will is the same one that we're talking about with the origins of the universe. How does a nature be itself, but also go beyond itself without somehow no longer being itself? How do I choose to be an engineer instead of a musician, and that be my choice, but also not something like, how can it be my choice, but not something that was forced by who I am? Because who I am was itself the product of causes. It needs to be from me, but not limited or restricted by who I am. It needs to somehow be both deterministic and indeterministic, my nature and more than my nature. And that, I think that always ends up with a contradiction. I mean, I'm babbling here, I'm talking incoherently, but that's exactly the point. Both of them are incoherent. They're both incoherent, but their incoherency coheres. They're parallel incoherencies. Right. And if I sound crazy, that's how anyone sounds who tries to talk about the origins of the universe or free will. Right. I'm merely lining the two conversations up and saying, you guys are saying the same things here.
No, you're doing a great job too. And you do a great job of communicating in a very accessible way that really, like, I could recommend this book to my mom, no problem.
Well, I appreciate it.
Yeah. So okay. So I know why, okay. So why did you tackle, I mean, obviously there are the other issues that you tackle in the book, but the Trinity is kind of like the big one that takes more than half of the book. So why the Trinity? Why did that? I know, the first time I think I ever saw you was at the, well, I wasn't actually physically present, but I watched the videos of the Trinitarian Ontologies conference on YouTube. That's the first time I ever saw you. So that's how you stuck in my mind as like, oh, that guy. And you kind of look a little bit like my son. How tall are you, by the way? I have to ask. You're a big dude.
I say I'm 6'3", but my wife insists that I'm 6'4". There's a whole argument that we have that's much more enjoyable when we're actually having it than when I'm describing it here. But
you probably are really 6'4", because most really tall people have they tend to have bad posture and a tendency towards slouching. No, seriously, like really tall people, you tend to get a more accurate height measurement if you measure them laying down than standing up. because they're prone to back issues, all that. I'm reasonably tall. I'm like 6'1", but my son is like, he looks a little bit like you do. But he's 6'5" and a very large, wide human. So anyway, just a little. So yeah,
Cool.
so obviously, clearly you were involved in that conference. So obviously you've had a long-standing academic interest in the Trinity. But why did you decide that that's the topic you were going to tackle in your book here?
Yeah, so I think the main thing is that I think all of these different subjects I've talked about are ultimately Trinitarian, because I believe the universe was made by and in the image of a Trinitarian entity. And so I think all of these different debates, and there's about 12 different philosophical, theological problems that I go to in the book. Free will is just one of them. I think that ultimately we are stuck in 1,000-year-old debates, and these are 1,000-year-old debates, because we keep trying to make sense of something that ultimately can't be made sense of, and that is the Trinity and its reflection in all of these different areas. And I think that when we believe in the Trinity, we don't understand the Trinity, but it helps us understand everything else. And that's something I think I'm quoting from someone else, maybe it's C.S. Lewis. The Trinity the Trinity is that which we cannot directly look at, but in light of which all else is seen.
Yeah, that's really good.
And so if you allow the Trinity to be the central mystery and accept it, everything else ceases to be mysterious in its light. Because so like free will, I don't think we're ever gonna get anywhere closer on free will. I've been trying to read the recent stuff on it, and I just can't, because I'm just like, guys, we're not getting anywhere on this.
Yeah, it just seems like the arguments seem to be, it's just like, it seems to be like a rehash of slight reformulations of the same arguments over and over again. So most of these kinds of issues you're talking about. And also there's a tendency to avoid, like we kind of have a tendency to avoid the Trinity, I think, for the most part, because we know it's difficult, right? There's so many other things we'd rather talk about than the Trinity. So
yeah. Well, but I think all these other things that we're trying to talk about also
are illumined by talking about the Trinity.
Yeah. And there's a quote from Chesterton, where he's talking about, if you allow a mystery to inhabit the center of your worldview, everything else becomes plain and rational. But if you try to make the center of your worldview rational, everything else becomes mysterious. And the example he uses is that if we want to be strictly rational about free will, then we can no longer say, if you please, to the housemaid.
Right.
And so if we want to be strictly rational about free will, okay, but then the rest of our life ceases to make sense. But if we allow free will to be this central, vibrant mystery that we embrace, suddenly the rest of our life makes sense. These free interactions that we're having with everyone really are what they seem to be. And we don't have to negate our whole lived experience.
And it gives more meaning and dignity to everything.
Yeah, exactly. So I think by embracing the Trinitarian mystery, because this is the most ontological of the problems I talk about, is the Trinity, the being at the heart of the universe. By embracing that mystery at the center of our worldview, everything else makes sense. But if you insist upon having a rational ontology, nothing else makes sense. And so, yeah.
So which is more original for you? Your interest in drama and dramatic writing, or theology? Which came first for you?
Definitely the drama and that kind of stuff.
I can see that.
I only started taking religion seriously when I was basically about to start college, around 17 or 18. Yeah, the drama creative side of things is much more chronologically part of my story, but I think it's also much more just basic to who I am. I could see myself giving up theology, but I can't see myself giving up this way of doing things. And there's part of me that doesn't really want to do academic stuff anymore, because I feel frustrated by it. And I think that if I continue to do theology, it might just be stuff like this. So,
Well,
I mean,
my next question was going to be, do you see doing things more in this form in the future? So obviously the answer to that question is yes.
yeah, I don't, not strictly the Socratic dialogue format.
Right.
Like I have a book that I'm talking about publishers with right now that's a series of monologues by Moses.
Oh,
And
that sounds fascinating.
and so like it would, I think I want to try different structures out. Like I said, I get bored very quickly. That's the ADHD side of things. I can do something for a couple of months and then I don't have the will to do it anymore. I'm one of the least disciplined academics ever, but I've managed to be successful because I just only ever focus on what I find enjoyable. And if I'm focusing on things that are enjoyable, then I can work till 2 a.m.
Yeah.
In an unhealthy manner, perhaps. But so, yeah,
I can identify. That's why I'm an autodidact and not an academic.
Yeah, I can't.
I just want to interested in what I'm interested in. That's how we went to read.
My wife, when I used to be a minister at a church, and my wife always joked that I became a preacher because I couldn't stand to listen to anyone else preach.
Yeah.
And yeah, I can't sit through a talk or a lecture or a sermon. Like I wish I could. I've tried my whole life to, but I mean, I almost didn't pass high school. Like I only took the academic turn when I kind of got really excited about something, and that was good. But until that point, like I think I was failing a lot of subjects. I had tutors in science and math and everything. So yeah, I'm not a normal academic, and that's a blessing and a curse.
Right. Yeah.
So
No, yeah, absolutely. So that's interesting. What was it that so it was just getting excited about something that kind of turned it around for you? Like you just found, like, were you just disinterested? I mean, obviously you're smart, right? So there's no doubt about that. So like the intellectual capability was there all along. That's pretty obvious just from talking to you and having read your book.
yeah.
And also you're very funny, and it's hard. Usually dumb people aren't funny. So what was it that made you apply yourself more suddenly like that?
I would say it was, I kind of had a faith experience right at the end of my senior year of high school. And that experience got me excited about religion in a way I'd never been before. And then when I was at college in my first year, I discovered philosophy and realized that philosophy and theology could actually connect. And some of that was overly Christian apologetic-y. But I think a lot of people use that as a means to discover something much more profound. And that discovery, it got something that my mind could be consumed by, excited by, on an intellectual level, but also a spiritual, emotional level. And I discovered C.S. Lewis, which is kind of a cliche. I know that evangelicals are all like, we love C.S. Lewis and stuff, but there's no other author that I can read that I read with such joy.
Right.
I usually have to force myself to read stuff, but
right. No, yeah, for me, I like a rediscovery of Lewis in college was a big moment for me too, because I kind of was raised on his fiction, right? On the Chronicles of Narnia. And then I was agnostic when I started at Thomas Aquinas College. And I had this meeting with I had the opportunity to go to have dinner. It was a big honor to get to have dinner with the priests on campus because they had the best cigars and the best liquor, and they cooked really well. So it was really like, it was a big event. And the names were drawn at random. So this was an exciting thing. And so when on the occasion when my name was drawn, one of the priests was an older German Jesuit named Father Gerard Steckler. And he looked me in the eye when we were introduced. He said, "Oh yes, Nathan, I remember you're the one who thinks he's an agnostic." So that just kind of like, and that was like right before the Thanksgiving break. And it's like, it just kept going in my mind. through my mind over and over again. So I went on this binge of reading Lewis and Chesterton,
Mm.
and that was kind of like the beginning of my own very long saga. So,
Well, an atheist can never be too careful of their reading.
yeah,
So,
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So were you raised in the faith?
so that's a complicated question that
Okay.
I'm still not entirely sure how to answer. My answer changes on that. We started going to church, I wasn't born in the church,
Okay.
but we started going to church at some point halfway through my childhood. But I'm Canadian. I'm actually from Vancouver.
Oh,
In
okay.
Vancouver.
I'm in Washington State, so
Oh,
we're in the same general
yeah, there we
geographic
go.
area.
Let's connect. No. So and Vancouver's, I believe it's still statistically the least church place in North America. I think it's maybe less than 1% or so go to
Washington is the least in the United States. So this is a feature of the Pacific Northwest corner of North America.
There's something geographically, it's in the water.
I think it's the lack of sunlight. It's very depressing.
Yeah.
It makes it very hard to believe in God.
Yeah, there's something about that rain. So yeah, I wasn't born going to church. I started going to church halfway through my childhood in a place where it was like, very easy to not be Christian. So I didn't know what Christian culture was. I'm in the States now, so I'm aware of all this. And my wife was raised in that Christian culture, but I didn't have a Christian-y childhood in the way that I think a lot of people that I know who are Christian did. So yeah. And anyways.
Do you see, as a theologian, do you see that there are advantages to that, perhaps, for you?
Oh yeah, very much so. I think it's just this, I feel like I have an insider perspective and an outsider perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I was never fully in the inside club. And so I think that's a very helpful way to come in, is not assuming this worldview. But it's also detrimental. It's exhausting never being quite sure and feeling like the child of multiple worlds. And never feeling fully safe or at home in either of them. So
yeah, that's that's interesting. JD, it's been an honor to have you on Grail Country to talk about your book. I hope that people will go out and buy it. It's very good. It's enriching and entertaining. One of the things that we couldn't really show through this conversation is just how witty and entertaining JD is as a writer. There's lots of great humor in the book, and lots of levity, to keep it from getting bogged down into too many layers of academic seriousness. Any closing remarks you'd like to make?
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a lovely discussion. Your beard is what I strive towards, but I'm a hollow reflection of your greater glory. And I don't know, that's weird, but thank you for having me.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Anytime, love to come back. And
yeah, I would love to have you on. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, one last sales pitch for the book.
I'm learning how to do this. You just have to hold up the book all the time.
I hope to see the Moses book in print soon, and I hope you continue to write these, delightfully original kinds of books where you treat theological topics in this sort of fusion with drama. I think it's really good.
Oh, I appreciate it.
Yeah, the Platonic dialogues are good for a reason.
Yeah, there's a reason we kept Plato's stuff, but not Aristotle.
Right, exactly. Amen. Thank you for joining me, JD. It was a delightful conversation, and yes, I would love to have you back again sometime.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good one.
Take care. Yep.
Should I actually leave now, or is this